Ladies and gentlemen, welcome in session 7 dedicated to trust and security. Now we will see a video record of the keynote speaker, Ms. Sabine Zwaenpoel.
Distinguished guests, dear participants, thank you for having invited me to give this keynote speech on behalf of the Director General for Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiations, DG NEAR. I regret that I cannot be with you in person, but looking at the panel, I'm convinced that the discussions will be very interesting. We are living in unprecedented times. Just look around us. On the 15th of July, Albania was struck by a large-scale cyber attack. Since the 22nd of August, a persistent cyber attack has hit Montenegro, and in early September also Kosovo reported cyber incidents. Looking at the other corner of the continent, apart from the conventional war that Russia launched against Ukraine last February, it has engaged in a cyber war ever since the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. Ukraine's public, energy, media, financial, business, and non-profit sectors have since then suffered from systematic cyber attacks. Since the 24th of February, more Russian cyber attacks have undermined the distribution of medicines, of food and relief in Ukraine. The impact of these more recent attacks has been all in all limited, not least because Ukraine, with the help of the EU, the US, and other donors, substantially invested in its cyber defense and resilience. In this respect, it serves as an example also for this region. Cyber attacks can be damaging not only for the infrastructure of countries, but also for their democratic foundations. When deployed together with other offensive actions, such as disinformation or economic pressure, cyber can be part of a hybrid operation. And today, with the return of war to the European continent and the intense geopolitical context we live in, we in the EU are therefore focusing our attention on building resilience against such hybrid threats. This region is increasingly falling victim to a battle of narratives and disinformation, with social media acting as a megaphone, which undermines the credibility of democratic institutions. This threat has only been growing since the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. In such a geopolitical context, we cannot fail to take these threats seriously. And unfortunately, there is more than one state using the cyberspace as a battleground. And so are also non-state actors. These trends and threats come at a moment where it is estimated that by 2030, there will be 125 billion devices connected to the internet, and 90% of individuals older than 6 will be online. This increasing reliance on digital technologies, a process that has been intensified by the pandemic, while beneficial, gives of course rise to vulnerability and has increased the risk of cyber attacks. Given the accessibility of the internet and relatively low costs of operations, anybody, be they individuals, professional criminals, state or non-state actors, could therefore become a perpetrator. As a result, both in the EU and in this region, key institutions and even critical infrastructure have for a number of years been targeted by cyber attacks. And as we witness now, these have only become more frequent and more sophisticated. Working together with the Western Balkans on security issues, and specifically on cybersecurity, is therefore of high geopolitical importance for the EU, not least as it is addressing our shared strategic interests. Resilience to cyber threats requires a collective, collaborative, and a wide-ranging approach transcending national borders. It should therefore not come as a surprise that in recent years there was a strong political support for enhancing cybersecurity in the context of EU-Western Balkan relations. From the Sofia Declaration of May 2018 to the Bordeaux EU-Western Balkan Summit conclusions, the European Commission has been highlighting the importance of closer collaboration on resilience building, on cybersecurity, but also on hybrid threats. We are therefore fully engaged in implementing the EU cybersecurity strategy, which was adopted at the end of 2020, and the strategic compass for security and defense adopted at the beginning of this year, as well as in the rollout of the digital agenda with our partners in the Western Balkans. The economic and investment plan for the Western Balkans also mirrors the same engagement. Now, what does this engagement mean in practice? And what type of support are we currently providing to help countering these threats? The European Commission, and DG NEAR in particular, are working on a number of initiatives in support of the region. First of all, we just finalized an extensive gaps and needs assessment in each of the Western Balkans 6 and at regional level that will serve as a guidance for the future capacity building support under the Instrument for Pre-Accession, IPA, in this region. A new program, Action, is being developed based on these conclusions, and we expect it to begin in early 2023, subject, of course, to final approval of the funding, which is expected to be around 5 million euros. Secondly, and responding to the urgent needs dictated by the latest developments, we accelerated the assistance to the countries that are fully aligned with the EU position on the conflict and with the related sanctions. And these are Albania, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. For them, a series of peer reviews with the help of TAIEX on cyber incidents response and preparedness is being organized, with an emphasis on the short-term gains to ensure the readiness for potential increase of hostilities in the cyberspace of the three partners who are 100% CFSP aligned and have been identified as hostile states by Russia. The workshops will be held in the coming weeks and months. Thirdly, and in the same spirit of emergency assistance, a recent initiative under the Rapid Response Pillar, under NDICI, tackling both disinformation and cyber resilience in Albania, Montenegro, and North Macedonia in the aftermath of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, was approved and is now being implemented as we speak. It is bridging the current support with the regional action foreseen to begin early next year. In the context of this support, assistance is already being provided to Albania and Montenegro to face the consequences of the recent cyber attacks they suffered. Under the bilateral support that we are planning for the years to come, there are various requests that have been tabled to step up cyber resilience, pointing at an urgent need. All these requests are carefully being considered, but will in any case need to be implemented in full complementarity with the above-mentioned regional assistance. Last but not least, the fight against cybercrime equally remains very high on our agenda. According to the most recent Internet Organized Crime Threat Assessment, IOCTA, published by Europol, cybercrime is becoming more aggressive and confrontational. And this can be seen across the various forms of cybercrime, including high-tech crimes, data breaches, and sexual extortion. Cybercrime is a growing problem for any country with a well-developed internet infrastructure, and where payment systems are online. But it is not just financial data, but data more generally that is a key target for cybercriminals. The number and frequency of data breaches are on the rise, and this in turn is leading to more cases of online fraud and extortion, according to Europol. Prevention and awareness raising remains therefore key, but also the second additional protocol of the Budapest Convention, opened for signature last May, is of extreme importance and a much needed instrument to effectively sanction cybercrime and obtain electronic evidence. We are happy to see that countries like Albania, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia have already signed the second protocol. And the Commission has a long tradition of teaming up with the Council of Europe when assisting our partners in this region, and preventing and fighting cybercrime is one of these policy areas where we have provided assistance through the iProceeds projects, which, as you know, are implemented by the Council of Europe. While not falling directly under the remit of DG NEAR, it can also be expected that cooperation between the EU's and the computer emergency response teams in this region will be further strengthened, and so will cooperation with the EU Agency for Cybersecurity, ENISA. The pandemic and the shift in the geopolitical reality on our continent has boosted at the EU level the investment in cybersecurity technologies development and deployment. Major initiatives are being taken to modernize our legal framework, the so-called EU acquis. These developments and the European perspective offered to the region make that cooperation on cyber capacity building, fighting cybercrime, and countering hybrid threats will continue to be high on our joint political agendas. The Western Balkan Digital Summit is therefore important, as it allows us to seize the political momentum and reconfirm our joint commitment to further reinforce, to further deepen and expand our cooperation in these domains. We commend the merit of this discussion today, which is more than ever needed, and I wish you a very fruitful debate. Thank you.
Now I invite the moderator, Nick Thich, panelists Chablis Stoner, Dave Forter, and Meryl May.
Good afternoon, welcome to you all, welcome to my colleagues and friends on stage. Let me first start by thanking Sabine Zwanepoel from the European Commission, DG NEAR, I think really for setting the scene in such a brilliant way, also elaborating on the policy actions, responses that the European Commission and DG NEAR undertakes in this. Secondly, also extend my thanks to the organizers. I mean, Rifat is here, but many other colleagues as well, for first of all bringing such a nice panel together. Really well done. And I'm also raising expectations here, so that's a second thing. But moreover, I mean, just to organizing this digital summit in such a brilliant way. I think it's really amazing the level of discussions, the level of speakers, and also logistically the way how you pull all of this together. Now, with any further ado, let's dive into the final part of today. So that will be my third words of thanks. This goes to all of you. Thank you for the brave to sit in here until the very last session of today. Not just sit in here, we try to also make it interactive. So at any stage, if you have a question, an issue, a complaint, well, I was about to say just throw things, but please raise your hand, and then happy to take all the questions, and then we move on. Just to introduce the colleagues on stage here, from our left to the right. First, we have Merle Megre with us. Merle, she is leading the cybersecurity work within the Estonian e-governance academy. I think colleagues certainly working in public administration here in the country, but also in the region, have for sure come across the e-governance academy, and most likely also with Merle herself. So that's first of all. Ladies first, Dave, so I move on to Shabliz. Shabliz is Shabliz Stoner. She's heading the cyber strategy and engagement team. I have to just look, probably there's some abbreviation as well, but so heading the cybersecurity strategy and engagement team within the Foreign Office in the UK. And Dave Forcher, coming from all the way from the United States. He's the founder and president of the One World Strong Foundation. And what that means, he will explain to us much more in detail later on, because he has a fascinating story to tell. One of the elements that Sabine Swanepoel in her intervention, in her keynote that she brought up, was this study that was recently, as she mentioned, recently finished for the region. Like what are the kind of the, well, shortcomings, the capacities that are needed in the region. Now, I think we are extremely lucky to have the main person in charge of that study with us. So where Sabine was giving us some kind of a teaser, well, I think Merle can really fill us in with the details. So Merle, I would say, question to you, I mean, lighten the veil a bit. I mean, what's in this study? So what are the main findings? What are maybe also the shortcomings, the challenges for the region in this respect?
Thank you very much, Nick, for the kind introduction, and thank you, organizers, for including me and the Voice of the E-Governance Academy as part of this panel. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Kosovo and to be part of this Western Balkan Digital Summit. So, building on what Sabine said, and ultimately to kind of introduce the topic, clearly cybersecurity is a crucial challenge. We have states, non-state actors and criminal groups competing and increasingly weaponizing the information space to seed misinformation, to attack the critical infrastructures, to steal information. As was said, this is not alien to you, unfortunately, here in the region, with attacks against Albania in the middle of the summer, Montenegro going through a tough time right now, and Kosovo reporting incidents, and more generally all of this going on in the context of war in Ukraine. So it was within this geopolitical context that our project, our study also was undertaken. The study formally titled the Cybersecurity Identification and Formulation Study in the Western Balkans. So it set out to map and assess the cybersecurity capacity building needs and gaps of the Western Balkan 6. And to also identify further EU engagement opportunities in this region. This project was financed and conducted in close cooperation, financed by the EU, European Commission, and we worked very closely with DJ NIR, and the E-Governance Academy from Estonia was in the lead, but we had also, we had in the team people from the Austrian Institute of Technology, from the Estonian Information System Authority, as well as from the Latvian CERT. So it was a great team of people, and the study was it was conducted in between January and June this year, so pretty recent. So what was this all about, and what did we find out? The study was divided into 6 areas, 6 key areas of cybersecurity. First, the institutional framework and governance, then legal framework, thirdly, risk management, then cybersecurity of critical infrastructure, critical information infrastructure. Fifthly, the capacities of CERTs and CSERTs, and last but not least, awareness and cybersecurity awareness and education. The core part of the information gathering were field visits with interviews and focus group meetings, We visited and came here to Pristina, as well as to Tirana, to Sarajevo, to Podgorica, to Skopje, and to Belgrade. And we had a team of the e-governance academy experts together with the local experts who met with the national competent authorities, the ministries, relevant ministries, the CERTs, the CERT teams, the private sector, telcos and banks, NGOs and academia. Then the study draft was validated. Yet again, we did a tour of all 6 and organized validation workshops with tabletop exercises. So it was intense 6 months, I can tell you. And very briefly, I mean, not to monopolize the microphone, but perhaps like a couple of points under each of these 6 main topics, 6 key areas. What were the main issues of cybersecurity in the Western Balkans, the main needs or the gaps as we identified them? So first, under the institutional framework and governance, 4 things. First point here, very importantly, the high-level political commitment for cybersecurity reforms and increased prioritization of cybersecurity needs was something that needs to be adopted at the government level, placing more stronger emphasis on how cybersecurity weaves into the digital transformation efforts. Then a need to support the competent cybersecurity authority to ensure that that authority can efficiently implement the cybersecurity strategy and conduct interagency coordination activities. Few, if any, structured public-private cooperation formats exists, even if there is an informal cooperation with the private sector, which could occur on a voluntary basis. Stakeholders with whom we met expressed the need for a more regular public-private information exchange, something that was touched upon in the last panel as well. And last point under this sort of institutional framework and governance title, the growing significance of the topic of cybersecurity topics within the foreign policy and international relations underline the need that there should be an inclusive process that engages public institutions, relevant public institutions, as well as other stakeholders in shaping and coordinating digital and cyber positions and digital cyber strategy within international engagements. So that was something that we identified. Moving on to legal framework. With regard to the protection of critical information infrastructure, legislative work is needed to harmonize the existing laws with the EU acquis, namely the EU Network and Information Security Directive and its revision, the so-called NIS 2.0. There is a need to strengthen the mandates, institutional mandates and cybersecurity and oversight roles. Under risk and crisis management, 2 main points. First, cybersecurity risk management frameworks just need strengthening. That was clear throughout the region. And also, crisis management frameworks appear to often lack consideration for cyber risks, and stakeholders were not often trained in cyber-specific crisis management. So that was something that we noticed as well, nor was there much training on the communication side, on how you can communicate to the public in case of cyber crisis. With regard to the cybersecurity of the critical information infrastructure, there is a need to raise the capacity of essential operators, critical information infrastructure operators, to prevent, to detect, identify, respond to, and recover from cyber threats and incidents. There is a need to strengthen the public-private partnership and to also the need to establish some regional cooperation initiatives across the CII operators. Under the topic of the CSIRT and CERT capacities, these capacities lack both personnel and equipment. and both operational as well as some initiating CSIRTs teams also require support to further develop their professional skills. And summing up this part under the awareness raising and education regarding the cybersecurity awareness raising, the strategic objectives, the agreed roles for who is to coordinate the cybersecurity awareness raising activities are often yet to be defined, and there is not really clear public polling going on to identify societal or target groups that need some targeted campaigning. Also, public employees and as well as CII operators lack skills in cybersecurity knowledge. I mean, people beyond the system administrators. And regarding the postgraduate, graduate and postgraduate cybersecurity education programs, ultimately there's just a limited budget for universities and limited for training institutions, as well as limitations in the availability of professors. So that was sort of like the gaps, and happy to discuss what sort of recommendations for follow-on could come from this.
Super, thanks Magla for revealing all of this, because this is really, I think, just to be aware for the audience that, I mean, the study hasn't been published, it's still under final revision by the Commission, so I think it's really some really breaking news and highlights that you're showing to the audience. Later on I will pass the floor to the audience also if there are like follow-up questions, but maybe jumping to Chablis here, just to, well, in terms of, I mean, the UK, EU, but maybe even global perspective, do you see like similar kind of challenges? Do you see similar even trends in terms of, well, cyber threats and security?
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, I mean, I think from the UK's perspective, we see there's sort of, I'd say, three key concerns that we have in the cyber landscape at the moment, which are global trends and global issues. And the first is that essentially internet freedoms are becoming more and more constrained. You know, we want to see, you know, I'll use the free, open, peaceful, secure cyberspace, which will enable everybody to benefit equally from the digital opportunities that should exist from the internet. And we want to work, you know, and so part of the problem with that is that, you know, we need to work with allies and partners to ensure that the global governance of cyberspace is shaped in democratic values that we support and want to recognise and see. And we know that there are states which do have, you know, who would like to see a more coercive and controlled cyberspace. And that, you know, that is a fundamental problem, because once we start accepting globally sort of technology which is based on an authoritarian, oh, I can't even say the word now. I'll come back to it, on a bias, then, you know, we lose controls because, you know, we can't take that back. We can't undesign something and then change it. Once it's out there, it's done. And I think the previous panel actually touched on it quite a lot. You know, sort of geopolitical tensions are increasing, and they're not restricted to the physical world anymore. They are being played out in cyberspace again and again. And that sort of malicious activity that we're seeing, whether it's from a state-backed actor or other groups, you know, that poses a continuous threat to our economic prosperity. It poses a threat to our democratic institutions, our critical national infrastructure. And it flows across all borders. And these things, you know, are really genuinely real threats to how we view the world. The other issue, though, and a sort of second concern which we have, which I haven't heard mentioned in the summit yet, but it might have just been in panels that I haven't listened to, is actually the issue of ransomware as a specific cybercrime. Now, given I've just spoken about the, you know, sort of geopolitical tensions, and we've had our, you know, speakers who have talked about sort of issues in Ukraine, you know, to talk about a specific crime, it, you know, sounds quite dramatic. But the trend we have seen from the UK is that the amount of ransomware crimes that we're seeing is increasing. And not only that, because you can now get ransomware as a service, criminal groups or anyone with the means can actually now start to buy the aspects and the tools that they need to inflict that crime. So the bar for cybercrime has been lowered, and it will continue to lower as more tools come onto the market for people to purchase. And I can say, most elite criminals, if you want to call them that, big organized crime groups, they will do the big incidents that we all read about in the papers. But it's just the individuals or the small groups or hacktivists who are conducting small-scale attacks on small businesses. And that becomes problematic, because if a small business or a medium-sized business in your country hasn't protected itself, or doesn't have the means to protect itself, then it will be held to ransom. We have some statistics in the UK, for example, that show 39% of small businesses report that they've had an incident or a cyber attack attempted on them. Not all of those would have been successful, obviously, but it shows the statistics. And once you get to larger companies, the percentage is over 60%. So it's not a niche market, that as a crime it's growing, and it should affect, it will affect all of us. And the third area, which I'd say is a concern, which isn't as bad as the other two, is actually, I'm going to frame it as human vulnerabilities, the human aspect for cyberspace. We know that criminals will exploit us no matter what. If I leave the front door of my house open, someone's probably going to come in and rob me. So in my digital world, if I leave myself vulnerable, someone is probably going to come and attack me if I'm not careful. And I think that, the amount of incidents that we are seeing being reported to our authorities in the UK, again, is increasing. Now, some of that is awareness of people knowing that they should report them. We still have to overcome a lot of, I almost say, sort of embarrassment or a lack of willingness to say, I've been a victim of this kind of crime. And we've got to overcome that. But more are appearing all the time, and our authorities are dealing with them constantly. I think last year, our National Cybersecurity Centre, who sort of looks after our operational aspects in the UK, took down, I think it was like 700,000 scams from the internet, which will be sent to UK customers and internet addresses, etc. And that's a phenomenal amount to be sort of being targeted by. And of course, that's just the ones they know about. What about the ones we haven't captured? So I think, there are opportunities in terms of the threat landscape which criminals are exploiting. My final point, and I'm sure it's, it happened around the world. When we had the pandemic, for example, there was a real uptick in attacks on healthcare providers. There was a clear correlation. And being mindful and being aware that those kind of things are going to happen, people are going to try to exploit whatever they think is vulnerable in your system. That is the sort of global threat. But I'll leave it there, and then you can come back with questions if you have any.
Super. Definitely follow-up questions will come, but I think for listing these three in such a clear way, appreciate it. Just speaking on the last one, on the third one, I mean, human factor, raising awareness, was also mentioned by Merle, also by Sabine in her keynote. Focusing on prevention, I think this also leads quite nicely, I would say, into Dave's story. So, as introduced Dave, I mean, Dave Forcher coming from the US, founding and leading this One World Strong Foundation. But I pass to you, Dave. I mean, what's the foundation? Where's it come from? And what's the link with this cyber security threats, the whole issue of today?
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, so you're wondering, why is this guy from a foundation here today, right, to talk to you? Definitely I'm not from the tech side, and there's people in this room that can attest to that. For me, much of what happened to form the foundation actually started here in Pristina over 10 years ago. So to be back here now talking about this, in what we're building and what you were all doing, I'm actually, and the foundation is a user of what you're building and what you're protecting. And it's been very interesting for me over the last couple of days to hear the stories and to hear about the technology here in this region. So my story actually starts a little over 10 years ago. A very close friend of mine, we've worked together for more than 15 or more than 10 years at the time. And I was in Dallas, Texas, was working with AT&T Wireless there at the time, and had just returned from a golf tournament that we were a part of, and I received a phone call. It was from my friend, my colleague, and he told me just straight up he was diagnosed with cancer, a form of leukemia. So it's one of those things where you remember exactly where you were when you hear something like that. And that, he's a gentleman that works out every day of his life, was Mr. Healthy. I would take the elevator to go get a coffee in the afternoon and the morning. He would take the stairs. My effort was to get across the street at the time, but there was one day he was working on dealing with cancer, and I called him. We talk every day, we text all the time, and I said to him, I'm just having one of those days. I'm just stressed. I had my own business. Brad worked for the business, and so I'm complaining to my friend that has cancer that I'm stressed. And he said, why don't you just go for a run? So I did. I found probably the only pair of sneakers I had at the time, threw on some clothes, grabbed my dog, who was on the couch with me, probably eating chips with me at the time, and we went for a run. We made it about a mile before my dog laid down, and I sat down next to him wondering why we did this, but we kept going. I got talked into doing a 5K event, then was talked into doing a 10K event. Then I tried doing a half marathon in the fall of 2012. And it was not a good experience, and I will call it, it's what a guy does. I didn't follow directions, didn't think I needed directions, and went out and just did it. Didn't hydrate properly, didn't eat properly, did everything wrong. So on my way back, I called Brad and I said, hey, if I'm gonna do this stuff, can I do it and help raise money for what you're going through? And he said, yeah, let me contact the person that's been helping me. 2 days later, I'm on the phone with this gentleman in South Carolina, I believe he was in, and all he heard me say was that I was from Boston and I wanted to run to help him. He then spoke for the next 15 minutes, and at the end of that 15 minutes, had signed me up to run the Boston Marathon in 2013. So if anybody's familiar with what happened in Boston in 2013, there were bombings. Okay, so I trained all winter long. I actually trained here in Pristina, in Grimea, up in the park in the winter. I did 18 miles in the park on a very snowy, very cold day. I have fond memories of being here and working with the company that's here. And they've all become very close friends and like family to me. The training was interesting. So I had a long run here. I had a long run in another country. When it came to my long run back home before the Boston Marathon, it was a disaster. Just the hydration didn't work, the food didn't work. Just a real quick, has anybody ever run a marathon before in the room? Okay, so the training, God bless you if you want to, I'm not trying to talk you out of it. But there's a lot of training that goes into it. But I will say this, the marathon itself is a lot of fun. So I got to Boston to run the Boston Marathon on April 15th in 2013. It was a beautiful day, absolutely gorgeous, great day for a run. That run ended as I was about to finish. I was just adjacent to the first bomb that exploded. I still remember the heat of it. I didn't know at the time, but I had actually had shrapnel go through my foot. I was in a heap on the side by the grandstands, but I could see everything that had happened. Many, many more people were severely injured than I was. Then 12 seconds later, there was another bomb farther down the street. My family was farther down the street, farther than that bomb that I saw, but I couldn't even hear it. It was just ringing in my ears. But I could see it and I could feel it, and I was seeing what was going on around me. And then I felt this throbbing in my foot and looked down, and there's a hole in my shoe, which just didn't make any sense. I'd been injured multiple times in this crazy training thing I was doing, but all of a sudden there's a hole. And then things started to very quickly come back to what had just happened. And again, my injuries were not severe. Many more people were injured much more severely than I was, but it's what I saw happen that day. People coming together. Not only the city, but the country and many other countries. I've seen cards and letters that came into Boston from around the world. It was amazing to see the support that poured in. And we had some of the best hospitals in the world in Boston, some of the best services in the world. But it became really apparent to a lot of us that not everywhere in the world are those things accessible to people. Those types of services, the things that happen after an event like this. And when we were in hospitals and rehab centers, we were visited by veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. They came to see us because they knew what the bombs were immediately. They knew what the injuries would be. And it was for the first time that many of us knew we'd be okay was when we could connect with somebody who had actually experienced something similar. That led us in 2018 to actually form a foundation to work with others that have been through things similar to ours. We had done some ad hoc things throughout the country. Orlando, the nightclub shooting. Unfortunately, as you all know, we have school shootings in our country. So we now respond to mass casualty events around the world. We work very closely with our US State Department. We work with other embassies. We work with other countries to connect with people that have been through these things. But it became apparent we needed more. We needed to use technology to reach more people. And I'll leave it there because I'll touch more on that in a little bit.
Thanks, Dave, for this, well, I mean, it's not a story. Thanks for this testimony, I think, to get the audience, well, really silent and quiet, in depth, I would say. Maybe after this, well, first round, I mean, in going into some of the challenges that the region is facing, that, well, the globe is facing, that countries are facing, anyone who, I mean, wants to jump in with a comment, a remark, question, anything that you would like to pose at this stage to the colleagues on stage? Anyone who wants to bring up something that he or she heard or wants to respond to? Not for now. Please, as said, anytime, just raise your hand and jump in. Well, moving from the, I would say, challenges I think that we have heard lined up, maybe move to kind of the responses. I mean, how might we, as countries, as regions, as organizations, how might we, as society in general, how might we respond to this? Maybe, Chablis, starting with you on this. I mean, how did you, or how are you as a country, as UK, working on this?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I mean, I think it's really important to sort of, it sounds really obvious, but it's, you know, the threats which we face and the challenges which we face mean that we can't keep leaving cybersecurity to another day. And equally, we can't keep leaving it to just our IT departments to deal with cybersecurity. We need to, like now, educate, empower citizens, businesses, to begin to understand that actually this is part and parcel of their everyday business, their everyday lives. When we launched in the UK, I'll use that as an example because I think it's quite important. We launched our national cybersecurity strategy at the end of last year. And one really important point in it is that we removed the word security. Because actually, it's no longer just about cybersecurity either. It's about the whole of cyber. And so we as the government started to look at the ecosystem, which the panel before was discussing, how do you educate people? How do you have the right skill set in your country to ensure that you're protecting yourselves? We started to look at technological advancement. How do you have the right environment so that businesses can innovate and create the next technology that you want to use? We also work, I come from the Foreign Ministry in the UK. How do we work internationally with partners? How do we sort of build our alliances together? And of course, how do we respond to threats and deter malicious activity, not only from those, sort of state-sponsored actors, which we might have touched on, but also from criminal groups. But for me, the key point, actually, which was the title of the last panel, is cyber resilience. Because it's only through building resilience that we can actually truly benefit from the digital economy, but be safe at the same time. And so for us in the UK, that doesn't just mean building our own resilience within the UK. It's about how do you help countries improve their cyber security capacities? How do they protect their citizens? Are there lessons that they can learn from us? How do we build confidence building measures so that citizens in those countries can trust the Internet of Things, all of the stuff you have in your pocket, your phone, your TV, which is connected to Netflix and, and the Internet. How do you build trust in those? How do you work on operational matters between certs? How do you share that information? How can you work together on crime and cyber threats which are impacting your country? And within that, there's a really important part in resilience, which is about building those partnerships, which I think we've seen here across the 2 days in the summit. It's about that collaboration. Like, no one country can fix this global problem and make themselves completely secure. You're only secure when everyone else is secure. And I think for us, that sort of whole of cyber aspect was important. And the whole, that sort of then makes it a whole of society effort to be part of that and actually, play your part in protecting your domestic situation, whatever that might be. I think the great example I have in my head of where, why it's so important that the whole of society get involved and play a part in cybersecurity in particular. I think if we go back to sort of 2017 and the WannaCry ransomware attack, which I don't know if everyone will remember, it sort of infected, I think it was like 200,000 computers around the world, 150 countries, it was massive, really, really big. At the end of the day, when you really break it down, the reason that attack took place was because there was a weakness in the Microsoft Windows operating system, of which there was a patch to fix, but nobody fixed it. The patch was released when the weakness was identified, and companies didn't, update their systems. And as a result, 2 months later, adversaries went, well, I'll attack people then, and I'll see what money I can make out of this, and off it went. And you see that again and again with attacks. Most attacks, most cyber attacks are the result of either a fix not being applied or human intervention in some way not being robust. The panel before talked about the Colonial Pipeline attack. Now, again, if you break that down, the point of access for them to get into that billing system, which then led to the attack, was the theft of a single password. That was it. That's all it took for them to start the chain, which then caused, I'm assuming, millions and millions of dollars worth of disruption and, consequence. And that's just, again, from a very simple thing that actually, if the whole of society gets behind how do we protect ourselves and thinks about it, we might have prevented. You might not, but, you've got to build yourself in your defences in the best way possible.
Thanks again, Chablis, for bringing in this concept of this notion of the whole of cyber, the whole of society. It's not, at the end, it comes down to individuals, but there's a whole ecosystem behind. Second, well, the moving away from the cybersecurity to cyber resilience. I think we also heard this in the session and sessions before. But in making the connection to Dave, I even would call it like agility. Because resilience is like, well, we need to bounce back, right? I think the colleagues participants who also joined in for the previous session with Justin showing his, how's it called, this elastic band? Yeah? It's bouncing back. It always comes back in the same shape, which is good in itself. But what is missing there is the learning effect. So it's, well, bouncing back, but not better. It's just bouncing back the same, which is good in itself. But as, well, societies, as organizations, I mean, we should be more than cyber resilient. We should be cyber agile. We should learn from this. And I think this, I mean, brings me to Dave's story. Well, you did not only bounce back, but you created something. You learned. I mean, you learned, and you are working with others to learn from this. So happy to hear your, well, in what you did and building upon your story, like the lessons.
Thanks. And just first of all, I'm going to have you talk to my kids about updating the software because they don't listen to me. So the resilience piece of this was amazing. As I mentioned, we had some of the best services in Boston that were made available to us after that bombing. But also from work that I've done in other places, you don't get that kind of psychosocial support anywhere. And I had met a number of people across the country after the bombing. One of those people heads up a resiliency center in Newtown, Connecticut. And if Newtown, Connecticut rings a bell to you, it's where there was a school shooting, actually just a few months before the bombings in Boston. 23 people were killed in a school. There's a woman that started a brick and mortar resilience center that is the most used, best run facility I've seen anywhere in the world. And she and I started to talk about how do we bring resilience? How do we bring building resilience to other people? It's partnerships. It's collaboration in terms of how that's done. But we also started talking about what if we could put this on a phone? What if we could put building resilience, ways to build resilience on a phone? That led us to connection. How do we connect with others? How do we form a peer-to-peer group? Very similar to how the veterans came to help us. Because there's not a week that goes by that I still don't, 10 years later, speak to somebody in that organization. They're actually a big part of the application with us. They provided us the funding to actually build the application. The founder of that organization had said to me, will veterans be able to use this? I said, well, absolutely. Right? Anywhere, veterans can use this. So they had a big part in helping us do this because it wasn't coming from me. And the funding wasn't coming from me to be able to do it. It needed partners. And the idea of putting it into an application, you don't want me building an application. The security of it has always scared me because when people have been through events, traumatic events, the last thing you need to do is expose them to something. And we don't want to be the cause of exposing them. So security is so important. The things that you're doing, the networks you're building, the speed that you can get information to people that need it. We're working in places now, Mogadishu in Somalia comes to mind. We work with folks there. You're lucky to get patched up correctly. Forget the psychosocial support that comes next. But guess what? Most everybody there has a phone and they have connection. I heard a number before in one of the panels about how many billions of phones there are now. Okay, I've been to refugee camps in the Middle East. One of the first things I see are cell towers. People are connected. And providing them those services, because when we formed the foundation, we formed it without regard to race, religion, ethnic background, color, politics. None of that stuff mattered. It was just people helping people. So we formed the organization on 4 key pillars, okay? There's resilience building. That's one. That's why I smiled when you said it. There's connection, right? There's education. There's educating people on how to move forward. Beyond that is prevention, because many of us have survivors We don't want somebody else to go through what we've been through. So we've partnered with the McCain Institute in the United States to put together a prevention practitioner network. So the best of the best practitioners in the country are now coming together. They're actually going to be housed on an application that's being built here in Pristina. That application was launched last week at the White House, and again this week in Pittsburgh at a conference called Eradicate Hate. We have a lot of hate in our country. There's people that want to stop it. And I don't think you can ever stop everything, but we can certainly attempt to do it, as you just said. So as a foundation, we're putting those things in play that people will have access to via an application. Anybody can use it. There's no cost to it. Okay, that cost is taken care of by what we do. But we want people to have access to that, to build those networks with each other. And it's just as a quick example of a network that's being built right now. Bosnian diaspora. Okay, over 4 million people spread around the world. What they're realizing is they're losing their culture. They're losing that culture. And they want to get back together, but they don't want to use platforms like Facebook. Okay? And if there's anybody from Facebook here, I'm not knocking it, and I say the same this when I talk about Google. Okay? Google and Facebook are not safe places to be because you're giving them everything to be there. Okay? The only thing we need is an email address. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, guys. That's how you're able to connect to what we've put together and what we have secured. So when I hear you guys talking about security and I hear the network and the bandwidth that's needed and the speed and the latency, all those important factors you guys are building into a network, because what we want to do, the practitioner network that we're building in the United States, we want to then replicate that network and how you build that network regionally around the world. So we need strong regions with networks. Right? We need those things around the world. And to hear what you're doing here and to hear what you're reaching for is fantastic.
Thanks again indeed, Dave, for, I think connecting nicely to what Shiblis was saying in terms of, teaming up, partnering up, connection, and not only connectivity, but also real connection with people. Merle, also something that resonates to your findings, your recommendations, then specifically to the region?
Well, definitely, yes. Especially the need to build connection in between people, so work with people. And some of the work also has to be done on the legislation front. It may sound a little bit boring being spoken here from the podium, but nevertheless is important as to guarantee continuity. There are some pieces of legislation, mandates, defined roles and tasks and responsibilities put down on paper to make sure that things work. So perhaps, yes, on my end, as a follow-up to our assessment here on the ground in the region of discovering what are the gaps and needs, what we followed from that on the recommendation side, what could be recommended and what we have recommended to the EU to follow up with. So on the same sort of scheme of 6 areas, starting from the top, the decision makers, because I think in cybersecurity, like in any other policy making, there is a lot that depends on the political will of the decision makers in the country, as they, to a large extent, also define the budgets, especially for the state sector. So them being aware and understanding the importance of cybersecurity as part of the digital transformation is really key. And reinforcing the importance of cybersecurity through various political levels of the Western Balkan regional dialogue with the EU is definitely important, and something that was reinforced in the opening speech from DJ Neer as well. As well as focusing in the accession negotiations in Chapter 10, which is about the information society and media, and to make sure that cybersecurity is a focus there as well. In more concrete terms, for the high-level decision makers, we'd recommend some things like tabletop exercises to raise awareness, to test the to the command chain, to think of some of the dimensions in a cybercrime crisis management of like how much time it takes, what's the authority, what's the necessary cooperation, with whom do you need to talk, and how much transparency do you give to your decision making in talks with press, something politicians always think a lot. For more specifically those Western Balkan partners who do not have an up-to-date national cybersecurity strategy, we'd recommend support activities to be particularly target the finalization of the strategy and the action plan, because without the action plan and the budget, the strategy is just a paper that nothing else, a paper tiger. For furthering public-private cooperation, there's a need to support cooperation formats that include that bring together platforms that bring together the public, the cybersecurity stakeholders on the public side and the key essential service providers, as well as the civil society. And sometimes there are places in the region who have good practice about it. So there is best practices to be shared. And to build capacity in the area of foreign policy and international cooperation, there is room for trainings for the foreign ministry officials and other policy stakeholders regarding the cyber diplomacy, the international norms, responsible behavior in cyberspace. Also, the Tallinn Manual, which is an initiative from the NATO Cyber Center in Tallinn, which explains how international law applies in cyberspace, for example. So that's on this governance side. On the legal framework, there's need to pursue practical workshops on EU legislative standards, information sharing on case studies, best practices, and also study visits would definitely be useful. Recommendations in the area of cybersecurity risk and crisis management fall into three key categories. The first is about the need to clarify mandates and responsibilities of relevant institutions. Then it's developing information exchange and procedures for incident reporting. When and how do you report cybersecurity incidents? And thirdly, establishing response plans for cyber crisis, also to think of having a communication component as part of it. With a focus of the cybersecurity of the critical information infrastructure, recommendations address both the need to how to define and designate cybersecurity operators and governance system, and how to establish security measures and incidents notification obligations also to the operators. Something seemingly bureaucratic, but actually very, very important when you try to have a systematic approach to cyber crisis attacks solutions. Regarding the recommendations to support the strengthening of CSIRTs, there's offers to improve access to professional training and community building, to invest into state-of-the-art tools and equipment, and thirdly, to strengthen international and regional cooperation inter alia also by facilitating some regional cybersecurity exercises, because it's a good old Estonian approach that you build links at best when you do something together or are engaged in a sports-like, sort of like competition-like exercise type of things. And lastly, in the area of cybersecurity awareness and education, the report recommends to focus at raising the awareness of key target groups and the society at large to have some basic digital literacy, cyber hygiene, courses, online testing and awareness raising. A lot of this is available on open source these days. and to also work with the civil society as well as the private sector initiatives on awareness-raising efforts. A lot of good solutions out there. The state does not need to invent it all itself all the time. Regular public threat reports is an important way of raising awareness, and here I have to compliment the FCDO initiative of supporting the publication of a very good paper back in February, March, the overview of the cyber threats in the Western Balkans. Really interesting read, and I think the more people read about the concrete cases in a humanly understandable way, not in the techie language, the more both the decision makers, politicians understand the need to invest into this, as well as people understand the need to update software, to engage in some very basic personal cyber hygiene, and to introduce some basic rules within their organizations. So this is an important way of to have available more information about what's going on in the regions, to have publications about the attacks without revealing the classified details, but just to kind of have this trend of regularly publishing cyber threat assessments. Finally, as a long-term measure, we recommend to develop higher education study programs and curriculum in the cybersecurity field, and also some educational gaps could be remedied by academic mentorship programs, exchange of cybersecurity professors, both within the region and with the Western supporters, as well as to have some short-term and extracurricular education opportunities, such as summer schools or cyber Olympics or competitions for the students, something that is exciting for kids and attracts more future talent in the field. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Merle. Quite some work on the table and on the shelf for the region for the coming years to come, but I think it's well, in a way, nice that you lined it up, that the study lines this up in such a concrete way. Being fully aware that we are running already late, and that it is late already in the afternoon, but still giving all of you, or at least some of you, the opportunity to raise some questions. So again, directing ourselves to the audience, if you have a question, then please.
Hi, Luanda Domi from CEDAR program, USAID program. Thank you so much for your presentations, very inspiring talks and your work. I actually had a question for the report, and maybe that we can tie that to some countries' examples, maybe from UK. You have mentioned two categories. One was in the report for CII, identification and designation, so critical information infrastructure. And then second, I believe, was in public-private partnership formats. Now, we are increasingly aware that critical infrastructure is being owned by private sector. And then there is this, when it comes to cybersecurity, increasingly difficult to do public-private partnership beyond the transactional approach of procuring a company or to protect, for example, essential services. So my question would be whether there are recommendations in the reports about what formats could be applicable in the region. Kosovo would be great. On public-private partnerships that could work in terms of protecting critical infrastructure and CII, and whether there is an example also that from the UK that could be useful for this conversation. And Kosovo actually is going through this process for the moment, so this would be very useful. Thanks.
No, thanks to you. Great question. Maybe Merle, starting with you from the report, and then Chablis maybe turning to you.
Yes. Yes, it's a rich topic, and I'm probably going to scratch only on the surface of it, because, well, basically what we discovered that there are a lot of good initiatives already at some parts of the region already ongoing. For example, there's quite some cooperation between banks. There are some banking associations. There are even some banking certs that talk to each other, because it's very practical. If one gets hit, it makes sense to share this information with others. Now, there is a need to take that to a higher level, and when inserting these public-private partnership platforms, I think when looking at it from a state perspective, it's useful first to have a running or sort of like vision about how at least you would like to have the interagency cooperation format, because in cyber no single agency can do it alone. You need a number of different stakeholders to come together. You need to have some sort of like functional interagency cooperation, and it's useful to identify some agency who is the owner and driver and secretariat of those meetings, or that cooperation, and then you add up the civil society and necessary critical information infrastructure actors, assuming that you have them defined first, of course. And if you don't have that, you should start by defining them. And then tap into some of the informal networks existing already, because ultimately it's in everybody's interest to work together. The state should be interested in having the private sector, the critical essential services, report incidents and adopt security measures. The private sector should also have something for it going on their side. So there can be, it should be a two-way street. So either trainings or information about threats that's available to national certs that could be shared. So this is how you start getting it going. There are some positive examples of it. For example, an informal groups that have started to formalize their activity. For example, Neretva group or some of the others in the region. But there's a question like how to support those nucleuses so that they become more regular and institutionalized, to make sure that if people change and rotate out, it wouldn't sort of melt away.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything that you've just said there. And I think in the UK, I mean, I can give a sort of brief example of one of the ways which we approach PPPs, in that we operate, so through our CERT in the UK, we operate what's called an I-100 program, which is Industry 100. And essentially, there's several components to it, but two of the key components is we have sort of a membership approach with industry players who sign up to get threat assessment reports from our CERT, and vice versa. Because often, in most situations, you know, big business will be monitoring attacks too. You know, they have important information that needs to come. So it's a two-way sort of mutual beneficiary approach that we take. The other part of I-100, which I think is really interesting and useful, is that it embeds industry players, industry people, technical experts, into the CERT. And they operate on a voluntary basis. So they give up, the company agrees that they will give up a day, a week, 2 days, a month, whatever the contract might be. But they then take off their commercial hat and put on a national hat, if you will. But they bring with them all of their expertise from the private sector. And to me, that's one of the key things, because I think if we start looking at capacity building and things like that, governments, no matter the region, we're never going to have enough capacity and knowledge to retain ourselves. We're never going to be able to, frankly, pay people the salaries which they would require. You know, there's always going to be brighter opportunities in the private sector for them. So you need these partnerships to work really well. And that the I-100 program, as I say, is one of the ways that we do it, and it seems to work quite effectively. But it is a two-way street, and I think that's always key. And I think we've all touched on, that element of trust and sharing of information, and that's, again, it's really important. The more distrust you have between yourselves, the harder it is to either learn any lessons that we might want to get, but also the harder it is to share information in real time as something is happening. And that's probably the most valuable aspect.
Thanks, colleagues. Thanks for the question again. More other questions someone would like to bring up? Not for the moment. I'm quite sure colleagues are also available, over coffee. Do we still drink coffee late in the afternoon? Well, are available over beer, wine, everything. Or I think you can also contact them when it's in reasonable numbers and hours. Maybe just to conclude then, and before thanking our panel members, just if you colleagues would like to end with like one silver or golden line, some key takeaway, like for the audience today, is there something that we haven't prepared this? So I'm just throwing this to you, seeing how responsive you are and how agile you are in bouncing back. So anyone who would like to kick off and just like one key takeaway, please, Dave.
I would just say partnerships and collaboration. I know that's two things, but together. And speaking to that, it's really the Netzio team that's here that helped us build this and what it's going to become. Huge thanks for that.
Super. Partnerships, collaboration. Mary.
Well, I'll be practical and like building on what DJ Nair said earlier. The EU really is committed to support the cybersecurity capacity building of this region in very concrete terms. And I see many familiar faces in the audience. We are happy to work with you to bring you the best from Estonia and the best practice from Europe to keep up the good work of cybersecurity in the region.
Super. So the challenge is big, but support stands ready. So please.
Yeah, and I think I'll probably end on the thing I've been talking about for the last 2 days to everybody that I meet, which is, it is a whole of cyber, whole of society approach. Again, none of us can do it alone, but actually, it's only when you look at the whole system. Your IT company's not going to be able to just do everything that you want them to do. You need the person with the iPhone to be updating their passwords. You need strong passwords for your computer. Get your children to change their passwords, Dave. That's all of these things, all of these aspects. You need to build capacity. You need to build education. If you don't do the whole of it, however small, if you don't approach it in that whole way, then you're only tackling a small part of the problem, and that will remain an issue for everybody globally.
Super, thanks for these nice words. Just to conclude from my side, before thanking officially the colleagues, on all these three elements, I would say, being it on the partnerships and bringing people, organizations together, also on the EU support and also on the whole of society approach. I think this is also where this is from the OECD Sigma, where we also come in. Linking it to also the previous panel where, we had Ludmila from Ukraine, where she also said, well, this summit is great. What you're doing here within the Western Balkan 6, it's super in terms of teaming up, exchanging, learning from each other, bringing the EU the EU countries, bringing also outsiders. She said, well, to quote her, this is also what we would need, in our region. And again, this is also where we come in as OECD Sigma, because we're working with the Western Balkan 6, also with Turkey, but we're also working with the Neighborhood Policy East countries, ranging from Ukraine, Moldova, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, but also with the South. So we're also working in countries like Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, you name it. So the challenges, that you listed, you have documented and studied them in a very thorough way, the challenges are similar. The challenges are similar. Probably even in those regions, if I can call like this, yeah, I think the collaborative effort is still to be there and still to be taken. So I think if you also as Western Balkan 6 can continue to work with each other in this, but also reach out, I think, to others, we fully stand ready and available to support anyone and the region as a whole in this efforts. So can I ask for a big applause for the panel? Thanks once more for the organizers for bringing this panel, but also this whole event together. And thanks to the audience for sitting here with us until late in the afternoon. So big thanks to you all. Big applause to you.